I want to thank Tom DiLorenzo for the invitation to speak here. I was telling some folks at my table earlier, this is the first Mises Institute event that I've attended that was not in Auburn. And so it's great to know that the Institute can take the show on the road, so to speak, and people will come out for it. So it's wonderful to see all of you. I do feel compelled to issue a slight correction to what Tom said earlier. I'm not actually directly appointed by Governor DeSantis to my position. I'm a couple of steps down from that. If you're familiar with the way the state university system works in Florida, there's a group called the Board of Governors that the Governor DeSantis appoints most of the members of that board. And then they kind of act like a corporate board for the university system, and they hire the chancellor. So you think of like a corporate board hiring a CEO. The Board of Governors chooses the chancellor of the system, and the chancellor is my immediate boss, Ray Rodriguez. He was in the legislature for a long time here in Florida. He's considered to be an ally of Governor DeSantis. And I answer to Chancellor Rodriguez. But I work in a building in downtown Tallahassee, the Turlington building that houses the Department of Education. Although it's kind of weird because the Board of Governors that I work for is not part of the Department of Education, it's a separate thing. And so the Florida Constitution defines all of this, and it took me a little while to learn some of the ins and outs. But I've been on the job for about 6 weeks. It's been a great experience so far. I'm working with a lot of great people. And when I first got the job offer, shortly before Christmas, Chancellor Rodriguez told me, I know you're in the middle of an academic year as a professor. I know you might have contractual obligations to your university. And if you need to, then you can wait to come down to Tallahassee until the end of the academic year in May. And I thought, I kind of have a feeling that the first few months of 2025 might be kind of interesting. And so I told him, I think I'll come down in January if that's okay. And so my university was very accommodating. They allowed me to leave midway through the academic year, and we were able to work all that out. So I'll be talking a lot about some of those interesting things that have been happening in the last few weeks. But my topic is trends in higher education and red state strategies. And so I'm going to start by laying out some of the kind of high-level issues and concerns that a lot of higher ed leaders are wrestling with. And then after kind of establishing that macro context, I will explain how the political leadership in the red states are trying to implement some reforms that they hope will put higher ed on a firmer footing for the long term. And I do want to say at the outset that everything I'm going to tell you is publicly available knowledge. I'm not going to share any secrets of the internal workings of things that can't be public. But I think most of you probably are not looking at the headlines dealing with higher ed every day. So a lot of this will probably be new information for most of you. But let me start with the kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which has really nothing to do with the usual political suspects. It doesn't have anything to do with Donald Trump or woke activism, anything that's happening in Washington. It's what everyone in higher education has been calling the demographic cliff. I don't know if any of you have heard this phrase before, but it's been on everybody's radar in higher ed for about a decade. Enrollment in higher education nationwide peaked in 2010. That was the year where the sort of demographic wave of millennials sort of crested, and those people were in their late teens, early 20s at that point. And since 2010, higher ed enrollment has been in kind of steady decline, although kind of gentle decline since then. And everybody was expecting that gentle decline to accelerate in the fall of 2025, this coming fall. And the reason for that is that American fertility began a decline after the financial crisis of 2008. Between 2008 and 2018, the United States total fertility rate fell from 2.055 births per woman, which is very close to replacement level for the population. In 2018, it was 1.776. That's like a 13% decline in fertility. And so that means, of course, that if you don't offset the the decline in fertility with bringing in immigrants from outside, that means there will be fewer 18-year-olds to go around than there used to be, right? So fewer incoming freshmen at colleges and universities across the country, because steadily fewer people will be reaching that age between now and the mid-2030s. So this is the looming problem that higher ed administrators have been trying to anticipate and figure out strategies to deal with over the past decade. But the problem materialized sooner than a lot of people were expecting, and that was because of COVID. So in 2019, enrollment was looking pretty good, but over the following 4 years, between 2019 and 2023, the number of traditional undergraduate students, that's 18 to 22-year-old students, in American colleges and universities dropped by 6%. That's about 900,000 students total spread across the country. And then enrollment in the fall of 2024 ticked back up a little bit, but that's expected to resume its decline very soon. So with fewer 18-year-olds to go around every year, colleges and universities have responded in a number of different ways, and some of you may be familiar with some of these strategies. They've tried to increase their market share vis-a-vis the other colleges and universities out there by trying to more aggressively recruit this dwindling supply of future college students. So if you're the parent of a teenager, you may have noticed that the recruiting postcards and things like that from the universities are starting to show up earlier for your children than they did for you when you were their age. They're starting to aggressively go after high school juniors. Sometimes they are targeting students who are even younger than that because they want to try to grab the loyalty of those high schoolers before they make that decision, presumably in their senior year, about where they will go to college. And they also have attempted, colleges and universities have attempted to enroll a lot of international students. That's been happening a lot over the last decade. And then that has led to some interesting side effects, leading to concerns about immigration discussions and things like that that have been going on in the political discourse in the last few years. But the great thing for colleges and universities about recruiting international students is that if you bring in a wealthy foreign student, typically you're getting a full tuition paid by that student's family or that student's government. And so that was a very tempting thing for a lot of colleges and universities, and they went after that with great gusto in the 2010s. A lot of colleges and universities have tried to bring older students back to school by offering them degree completion programs or by offering them graduate programs, especially graduate programs that are offered online. And so when you look at college enrollment data, the number of graduate students enrolled as a percentage of total enrollment has gone up quite a bit in the last decade. And that has led to, of course, credential inflation in the general population. If you go back to 2011 and you looked across the American population, like what percentage of people had graduate degrees of some kind, it was about 11%. And today it's closer to 15%. So you've had a significant uptick in that over the last 10 or 15 years. But all these kinds of measures have been insufficient to prevent a wave of college closures since that peak in enrollment in 2010. So between 2012 and 2019, quite a few colleges closed. Most of those were the for-profit universities. And you might remember some of the scandals that broke about 10 years ago with some of these when it came out that a lot of them were kind of using pretty dubious business models that hinged on recruiting these adult students and then loading them up with federal student loans. And then the colleges would pocket all that loan money in the form of tuition. And then very often the students would never graduate. And then they had this debt burden that they had to carry with them. And so a number of those colleges got in trouble for one reason or another, some of them through lawsuits, some of them just very bad publicity. Many of them closed between 2012 and 2019. Some high-profile examples of this were Corinthian colleges in 2015, ITT Technical Institute in 2016. Some of you probably remember these names. So since 2008, there have been more than 200 for-profit colleges and universities that have closed. But then after COVID, you started to see a number of nonprofit colleges close, both public universities that are state-funded and somehow, and also private nonprofit universities, many of them with some kind of faith affiliation. More than 70 of these have closed since March of 2020 when COVID hit and everybody went home for the rest of that semester. Where I came from in Alabama, Judson College and Birmingham Southern Colleges are two Christian colleges that closed just within the last couple of years. And they're spread out all over the country. But in most of these situations, the universities and colleges had to close because of their poor and deteriorating financial condition, which is tied in large part to the enrollment numbers. And if a college gets to the point where the financial condition deteriorates and they lose their accreditation, that's pretty much the death knell for that college. Now, the Federal Reserve, which we all know and love dearly, has predicted that another 25 to 80 colleges are likely to close over the next 5 years. These are public and nonprofit colleges. And it depends on how acute the enrollment problems become over the next 5 years. So 80 is their worst case scenario. That's predicated on a 15% decline in enrollment between now and 2029. But there are some other groups out there that are predicting even steeper declines and larger numbers of institutions closing. And the colleges that remain open will probably have to downsize to some extent. They'll have resource constraints in a way that they haven't earlier. As I'll talk about in a minute, a lot of state legislatures are becoming a little more parsimonious in the way they want to fund higher education. Families are much more resistant to the high tuition rates that a lot of these schools charge. And so they're going to be squeezed in a way, and then they're probably going to have to do a lot of introspection and figuring out like what is really core to our mission and what do we really need to hang on to and what will we need to let go. So that's all coming out of this demographic cliff. That's the big thing that all the colleges and universities are wrestling with. But the question of college enrollment going forward is not just about how many potential students there are, but also whether those potential students think that it's a good idea to attend an institution of higher education. And the fact is that the percentage of the American population that has confidence in higher ed has been declining over the last decade. It's at a record low today. Somewhere in the low to mid 30% of people, when they are polled, will say, yes, I think American higher education does a great job and I have confidence in it. 10 years ago, that number was more like 65%. So in the last 10 years, a tremendous drop-off in public confidence. So some of these polls have asked people like, well, if you're not confident in American higher ed, why is that the case? Why do you feel this lack of confidence? And these polls have returned some, a few, top-line concerns kind of for potential students and their families. And the number one reason that people give for not trusting higher ed these days is politicized classrooms and politicized campuses. Now, the personnel, the faculty, and the staff in higher ed have always sort of skewed to the left politically compared to the overall population of the country. There have always been more liberals than conservatives in higher ed. But if you look at the 20th century, I mean, there's definitely an imbalance, but it's not a crazy extreme imbalance. I mean, it's to the left of the population generally, but not by like orders of magnitude. But over the last 25 years, for whatever reason, that disparity has become very extreme. And some disciplines, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, and I'm a humanities guy, so this is very painful for me to talk about, some of these disciplines will skew 25 to 1 or more in terms of voter registration, Democrats versus Republicans. And many of these humanities and social science departments have actually redefined their missions. They will talk about this openly to say that progressive activism is now a defining feature of our discipline. And this is being touted as a selling point. This makes us more relevant to the public conversation and things like that by defining themselves in these kind of far left terms. The so-called Great Awakening that took place during Barack Obama's second term got seemingly turbocharged during the Biden administration, as you well know. And critical theory and DEI and gender ideology just seemed to be everywhere. And then the reaction on campuses to the events of October 7th, 2023 shocked much of the political class that up until then had been kind of acquiescing to a lot of the woke stuff that had been going on. So by 2024, dissatisfaction with the political climate on campuses had kind of reached a boiling point, not just in red states, but in a lot of other areas as well. So that's the number one reason why people are dissatisfied with higher ed. But then there's more beyond that. There's also dissatisfaction with the debt burdens of students and also the job prospects of recent college graduates. So if you look at the numbers on total student loan debt today, it's $1.7 trillion. That's mostly federally subsidized student loans, some loans from the purely private market, but that's more than triple the level of what we had in 2007. So just in 18 years, we've had this explosion. And not all students take out debt, of course, and I'm glad to say that Florida does better in this respect than a lot of other states. But among those who do, the median amount that they will borrow is somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000. And more than 40 million Americans now carry some amount of student loan debt. 20% of those Americans who have student loan debt are over the age of 50. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they've had a student loan payment following them around for 30 years. Some of them went back to school when they were older, but still this is a kind of a worrisome number. People who are, approaching retirement and they still have student loan debt. And that debt that they're carrying is yielding a lower return on investment than it used to. Just recently, there was a guy named Tom Owens who crunched some numbers for a Substack that I read, and he put together what he called a life difficulty index, which I thought was an interesting turn of phrase. He said it's the ratio, his life difficulty index is the ratio between what it costs to have what he calls a starter life in terms of housing and basic transportation and things like that, comparing that to the median starting salary for college graduates. So he says that in the year 2000, that ratio was 4.32. So you buy a basic house, you buy a car, and that would cost you about 4.32 times your likely starting salary. You fast forward to 2023, and that ratio had risen to 7.61. So a 76% increase of what it costs to have a starter life compared to your likely salary. So this is one reason why a lot of young people today are very upset with the system, and they're thinking, my grandparents were able to go out and buy a house for $10 on the coast of California, and now I have to, pay $2,000 a month rent to live in a shoebox or something like that. So that's where a lot of that animus is coming from. I think it's important that those of us who are in the older generations have some kind of understanding of why that's the case. It's not just young people griping about things that they shouldn't be griping about. So all of these factors, politicized campuses, the debt burden of students, declining ROI for college degrees, all of this is why people have lost trust in higher education. So those are the macro trends, but we also need to be aware of the changing context of the federal regulation of higher education. And this is changing by the day, it seems. I've was telling people earlier, since it seems like every day since I started this new job, there's either some wild thing coming out of DC or some wild thing coming out of the state capitol in Tallahassee that my office has to react to somehow. We're trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean for us? Does this mean we got to change our regulations or what we're telling the universities or this or that? So it's a very dynamic and fluid situation right now. So presumably Linda McMahon will soon be confirmed as the Secretary of Education. President Trump, of course, has repeatedly said that he wants to shut the Federal Department of Education down. I don't know if that'll happen, but even if it doesn't, the changes that the Trump administration has already announced are really an earthquake for higher education. So even if we still have the DOE in a few years, all the stuff that has already happened is huge. The administration has attempted to pause the flow of grant funding to universities from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Now, though that pause has been temporarily blocked by federal courts, but the writing does appear to be on the wall for future grants that either will be eliminated entirely or greatly reduced. And similarly, a recent memo from the Department of Health and Human Services announced that only 15% of grant amounts could be used to cover overhead expenses by universities. Some of the Ivy League schools had gotten into the habit of charging more than 70% of the grant amount for overhead. So we're talking about billions of dollars a year that are on the line here for a lot of these schools. And as for the Department of Education specifically, you may have heard that the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program has been shut down. So a lot of people who haven't had to make student loan payments in recent years, that's kind of now on the front burner again for them. Just this week, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals made a ruling that said, the Biden administration never had the authority to do that student loan forgiveness program. And that was the second attempt. That was the second time that the Biden administration had tried to do something. The courts had already struck down the first one. They came back a second time with a somewhat smaller amount that wasn't quite as expansive, but the courts have struck that one down too. And then just last Friday, on Valentine's Day, a Dear Colleague letter went out from the Department of Education to all campuses that warned any college or university was in danger of losing its federal funding if it did not end any and all race-conscious activities within 14 days. So everybody is reacting to that news now. Higher ed is also still digesting a more subtle but still important reform that was implemented during the first Trump administration and that the Biden administration left alone. This is one of the few things that Trump did in the first term that Biden didn't try to undo. But this has to do with accreditation. And I don't want to bore you with the details of accreditation. It's really like mind-numbing stuff for regular people, but it's critical for the way higher ed works. A school's accreditation determines a lot of things, not just access for its students to get Pell Grants and Stafford loans and things like that, but also the ease with which students can transfer credits from your school to another school, or whether graduates of your school can get into graduate school. I mean, all of this is tied to accreditation in various ways. So the change that the first Trump administration made, and this was in February of 2020, it eliminated the distinction between the so-called regional accreditors and the national accreditors. Now, if you know anything about accreditation, you probably know that the regional accreditors were considered to be the top tier accreditors. There's a half a dozen of these in the country. Here in Florida and in Alabama, where I just came from, the regional accreditor that everybody had to use was called the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, Commissions on Colleges. SACS is the abbreviation that people use for that. But these 6 regional accreditors function like a cartel across the country, and they had very similar standards in most cases, and you were geographically locked in to the accreditor that was designated for your region. And if you didn't get regional accreditation, there are all kinds of limitations on what your students can do and what they have access to. Now, this reform that the Trump administration made is it eliminated that distinction. So it said all the accreditors, no matter whether they're these formerly regional accreditors or the national ones, they'll all be held to the same standard. So at least on paper, all accrediting bodies that are recognized by the Federal Department of Education are of the same quality. Higher ed still hasn't kind of worked through the implications of that. I know there are still universities in the Florida system. Just within the last couple of weeks, I was looking at one of our member schools that had it written into their own policies, we will only accept transfer credit from these other regionally accredited schools. And of course, that's not something that they can really do anymore. That policy is going to have to change. So they're still kind of working through some of these implications. But now that you're not locked in geographically, that was the other change. It said no difference between regional and national accreditors, but also you're not locked into your geographic regional accreditor anymore either. And so that means that it has all of a sudden gotten a lot easier for colleges and universities to change their accreditor if they don't like the way that their current accreditor is doing things. And I'll come back to that in a moment because that's an important point. So that's a lot of context. Let me talk now about what the red states are doing. I'm glad Jonathan and Tho gave me about an extra 10 minutes here because I probably will go up to 11 o'clock. But just as COVID revealed a lot of problems in education, not just at the K through 12 level, but also in higher ed, red state governments have gotten increasingly comfortable with charting a new direction on education, let's say. And the fundamental thing that has changed here is that red state governments have become willing to exercise a greater degree of political control over public colleges and universities rather than giving them state funding and allowing them to determine more or less autonomously how they're going to spend it. So this is a really big deal, and this approach opens up this question. I know I'm probably talking to a room full of libertarians here. When you ask a libertarian, what do you do with a state college or state university, what does a libertarian say? Privatize it, right? Like that's the one tool in the toolbox for libertarians. So this is something that the libertarians and the so-called fusionist, conservatives, libertarians. This is something that there's not any answer in libertarian theory for how to run a state organization like that on an ongoing basis in an effective way. So this all comes down to really prudential questions about if privatization is not on the table politically, which I think in most places it's not at the moment, not even in red states, then what do you do with these state colleges and universities? And up until recently, the red states have seemed to be comfortable with this sort of hands-off approach, a kind of very decentralized approach to say, we're going to allow the credentialed managers of these institutions pretty wide latitude in terms of governance. We'll fund them, but then they can decide what the priorities institutionally are. Now that approach has become politically unacceptable for all of the reasons that I've just been talking about for the last 15 or 20 minutes. So red states have begun moving toward a new strategy, and that strategy seems to be don't use taxpayer money to fund activities or ideas that are repugnant to supermajorities of your citizens. It seems like a pretty common sense sort of solution. It's a politically popular solution, as we've seen over the last couple of years. But then also, red states have begun working to improve the value proposition for higher ed in an attempt to put it on a sounder footing. So let me run through a few of the things that red states have been doing in this respect. One of the earliest attempts that they have done was to institute something called performance-based funding. Now, we've had that in Florida for about 10 or 11 years now. Florida actually tried it very briefly back in around 2000 when Jeb Bush was governor, and then there were some changes to the system and it kind of went away for about 10 or 15 years. Tennessee picked it up, and then Florida came back to it, and other states are now considering adopting a system similar to this. So under a performance-based funding or a PBF model, a percentage of the state colleges and universities' budgets or appropriations are dependent upon them achieving certain metrics. And currently in Florida, there are 10 metrics that state universities are judged on. Some of those benchmarks that they have to meet have to do with the employment rate of their graduates. Are your graduates getting jobs? What is the average salary of your graduates when they are hired? What's the net tuition cost to students to attend your university? What is the retention of it? Do people you admit as freshmen come back as sophomores a year later? If they come back as sophomores, they're much more likely to graduate within a 4-year time frame. Also, and then this is specific to Florida, how many degrees are you awarding in areas that the state has determined are sort of strategic emphasis? In Florida, nursing is one of those, for example, because we've got such a large percentage of the population of seniors who have come down here from other parts of the country. So if you want to get the full amount of funding from the state and you're a state university, you've got to hit certain targets on all of those things. And that has provided a lot of incentives for these universities to try to address some of these complaints that members of the public have had about the way they've been operating, to keep tuition low and to encourage students to select majors that have strong earnings potential and that sort of thing. Another area where red states have been innovating is in this area of accreditation that I mentioned a moment ago. Florida was a first mover on this. In 2022, the state legislature passed a law that mandated that the next time Florida universities come up for their accreditation reaffirmation, once they get through that with SACS, then they are required to begin the process to move to another accreditor. So we're starting to see in Florida a lot of investigation going on by the universities. Where are we going to go next? Which accreditation body is offering the best deal? Which one has less red tape? Because it's a very expensive proposition to get accredited. You've got to submit more than 1,000 pages of documentation. You've got to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, really, to maintain this stuff. And so this is a significant expense, and it's a very cumbersome process. So the hope is that this is going to prompt some competition among the accreditors now that you're not locked in geographically. And also, something that's been put in place at the federal level for new accreditors to be approved. And so it's likely that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see new accreditors coming online that have standards that are tailored to specific, maybe specifically STEM sectors or specifically for liberal arts colleges, that sort of thing. And so it's likely that we're going to see much more of a diversity of accreditation in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's probably going to be a net positive for higher ed. And that's just for institutional accreditation. We're also having to look at program accreditation. Like if you want to get a law degree, you have to go to a school that is accredited by the American Bar Association. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to take your law degree to another state and or you'll have to sit for the bar again in that other state. So some of these program accreditors do things that are pretty problematic from the perspective of red states. Just today, there was a news item that said that the DEI requirement that the American Bar Association had been enforcing on schools, they've now said, well, we're going to pause that, considering what's been happening at the federal level. So, that may go away, I don't know, but that's something to keep an eye on, certainly. Some states have already passed legislation that says no accreditor, whether it's an institutional accreditor or a program accreditor, can require a university or a college to violate their state laws. And so for states that have passed anti-DEI legislation, for example, if an accreditor comes in and tries to make a school follow DEI requirements, that would be prohibited in that state. The state would be able to bring some kind of action against them in courts if they tried to do that. So then DEI is another big one. Again, Florida is a first mover on this. In 2022, we had the Stop Woke Act, which most of you have probably heard of. And that was focused mainly on K-12. But then in 2023, we had this law passed in Florida called SB 266, which had a lot of really important things for higher education in it, among of which are Florida colleges and universities are now prohibited from expending any state or federal funds to, and the quote is, promote, support, or maintain any programs or campus activities that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or promote or engage in political or social activism. So student organizations are exempt from this requirement. So students can still go out and protest if they want to. That's part of their free speech prerogative. But departments and faculty cannot use state money or federal grants to go out and engage in this kind of activism. So there's been a lot of hand-wringing on campuses across the state over that, as you might expect. But it looks like some of that is going nationwide now, based on at least the racial preferences part of that. The Federal Department of Education is now saying nobody's going to be able to do this. That actually puts Florida in a pretty good position, because now the things that the Trump administration is saying you can't do, Florida, for the most part, has already gotten rid of that, within the last year or two. SB 266 also mandated a far-reaching reform of the general education curriculum at state colleges and universities. So this is all just kind of culminated in the last few weeks. The last Board of Governors meeting that was at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville at the end of January ratified this process that had been going on for about a year and a half. Now, according to this legislation, the content of courses that universities offer, if they want them to be able to satisfy general education requirements, the content of those courses has to be broad and foundational. So you got rid of all the upper division courses, you got rid of all sort of the courses on niche topics that were pet projects of professors. But the legislation also prohibited courses that were based on speculative or exploratory content, as well as courses teaching what could reasonably be interpreted as identity politics, or courses that, quote, distort historical events. And they specified in the legislation, so for example, if your course is teaching that America was founded to be a systemically racist country, then that's a distortion of historical events, according to the legislation. So this eliminated many humanities and social science courses based on critical theory, as well as identity-based courses such as African American history. African American history can no longer satisfy a general education requirement. That's just one example. So this legislation prompted the first full-scale curricular review that these institutions had done in many years. And every school's board of trustees had to approve a list of prospective courses that the faculty had submitted. Once that was approved by the board of trustees, it came to the board of governors office in Tallahassee. It had to be reviewed there. Some of those courses got kicked back for various reasons. And the end result of this process was that hundreds and hundreds of courses that had been on the list as being able to satisfy general education requirements had been taken off those lists. Just one example, the University of Florida in Gainesville had almost 1,200 courses in its catalog that you could take to satisfy a gen ed requirement prior to this process, and now that's down to less than 500, so more than half of them have been eliminated. Now, this process, as you might expect, led to many accusations that the legislature had infringed on the academic freedom of the faculty who taught the courses that had been removed. And there are lawsuits pending on some of these questions. One lawsuit says that you've infringed the professor's free speech by taking their course off the general education list. But it is important to note these courses have not been eliminated entirely from the university catalogs. Nobody is telling professors what they can and can't say in their classrooms. Nobody is saying you can't offer this course as part of a particular major's program requirement, or that you can't offer it as an elective. All it's saying is that it can't be part of the general education curriculum. That's not part of the priorities that the legislature has set for what general education in Florida ought to do. So I think that the prospects of those lawsuits succeeding is pretty low. We'll have to wait to see what the courts say. But also, my final point, red state legislatures and governments are not just passing system-level legislation like this. They're also beginning to act at the institutional level to alter the governance of those institutions by appointing reform-minded trustees. And many of you are probably familiar with what happened at New College in 2023, where a number of new trustees were named that were right of center, and they came in and made some sweeping changes. They fired the president, they ended the gender studies program of that, and they said, this college has acquired this reputation of being kind of a far left, hyper woke institution, and we're going to try to pull it back to the center and be kind of a level playing field where you can have open inquiry and civil discourse for people of all persuasions. So they're now in the second year of that kind of turnaround process, and we'll have to wait to see how that develops. But then last month, the day before I started this job, a similar thing happened at the University of West Florida. There were 8 new trustees named to the Board of Trustees at University of West Florida. And those trustees have not really been in position long enough to make any big changes. So we're going to keep an eye on that to see what they decide to do. If they do something like they haven't fired their president yet or anything like that, but 6 months from now, who knows what UWF is going to look like. I should also note that there's been a trend of kind of high-profile leaders in the Florida GOP that have become university presidents in recent years. The new president of New College, and I should say New College is actually part of the university system. It's unlike the state colleges around the state. But the new president of New College, Richard Corcoran, is a former legislator and commissioner of education. Florida Atlantic University just named Adam Hasner to be its president. He was a legislative leader in the GOP. And Florida International University just named Jeanette Nunez, the lieutenant governor up until last week, to be their interim president. So the Board of Governors just 2 days ago ratified those appointments of Hasner and Nunez. So this is all moving at a very rapid pace. One more, there's ROI coming down the pike. I mentioned how ROI has been a problem for people. I've spent all this money, what am I going to get for my education? And legislators are talking about ROI, that universities need to analyze the ROI of their various degree programs and use that as part of program review. Governor DeSantis issued a budget proposal a couple of weeks ago. There was money in that budget proposal for an ROI study at the system level. So if the legislature goes for that and adopts it, we're going to see something like that happening. And then presumably that's going to inform what the individual schools look at in terms of which programs are we going to keep and which programs will we get rid of. So there's a lot of that stuff that's still up in the air, but other states are following Florida's lead on a lot of these issues. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next few years. The joke that's going around in Tallahassee right now is that we're trying to make America Florida. And we'll see, but hopefully there'll be some good progress on all these questions in the next few years. Thank you.